Ever wonder how those life-saving techniques, the ones they use in emergencies, are constantly changing?
Yeah, like how we're always learning better ways to help people when every second counts.
Exactly. So we're doing a deep dive today into the latest research from ILCR.
ILCR, for our listeners who might not be familiar.
All right, ILCR is like the ultimate authority on resuscitation. They set the standards for how to handle everything from a nasty fall to like a full-blown cardiac arrest.
Their recommendations basically shape how emergency care is delivered all over the world. It's pretty high-stakes stuff.
Absolutely. And the source material for today's deep dive is straight from the journal Resuscitation. Have you had a chance to read the latest issue?
Between you and me, those journals can be a bit dense, even for someone who lives and breathes this stuff.
No kidding. So we're basically giving our listeners the VIP tour, highlighting the most important findings from the past year.
And what I find fascinating is that this research goes beyond the nuts and bolts, the step-by-step of resuscitation. They're really digging into the why behind certain techniques.
And maybe even debunking some myths along the way.
Oh, absolutely. There are definitely some surprising findings in this research that challenge some long-held beliefs.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, let's take drowning. Seems straightforward, right?
Yeah.
Someone struggling in the water, you pull them out, you start CPR.
Makes sense to me. What's the debate about?
Well, there's ongoing research specifically on how to do CPR in the water versus once you get the person safely onto a boat.
Hold on, in the water, CPR, is that even a thing?
It is. It's a lot more challenging, obviously. Imagine trying to give steady chest compressions while you're both bobbing around in the waves.
Talk about a workout. I can barely do CPR on solid ground.
Right. It really highlights how even the most well-established procedures need to be adapted to the specific situation.
There's not one size fits all. You have to adjust based on the environment.
Exactly. And the article even mentions specific guidelines for boat-based CPR, especially for rescue teams who might be dealing with this out at sea.
Okay, that makes sense. So location, location, location. It matters in real estate, and it matters in resuscitation too. What other unexpected findings did this research uncover?
Well, this one might surprise you. There's been a lot of debate lately about chest compression only, CPR for drowning victims.
Wait, really? No breaths, just compressions. But don't drowning victims need oxygen more than anyone?
It's a natural assumption. And while the research is still ongoing, there's some evidence that conventional CPR, the kind with both compressions and breaths, might actually be more effective for kids between 5 and 15.
So age is a factor here, which adds another layer of complexity. But overall, the jury is still out on which approach is best for drowning victims specifically.
Exactly. There are studies that support both sides, and it really highlights how medical knowledge is always evolving. What we thought was best practice even a few years ago can change as new evidence emerges.
Okay, so while more research is definitely needed on that one, the basics of CPR are still crucial, right?
Absolutely. Knowing how to respond in those first few minutes can make all the difference.
And speaking of life-saving technology, what about AEDs? I feel like they're everywhere these days, which is amazing.
They've definitely become more accessible, which is great. But even with this technology, there are still some gaps in our knowledge.
Like what? I thought AEDs were pretty straightforward. You stick on the pads, the machine does its thing.
It seems that simple, right? But it turns out there haven't been many studies looking specifically at how effective AEDs are in aquatic environments.
Oh, wow. You'd think that would be a priority, considering how common drowning is.
You'd think so. And ILCR actually acknowledges this as a knowledge gap, which means it's definitely on the radar for future research. But it also points to a bigger issue: the challenges of implementing AEB programs effectively. It's not just about having the devices. It's about training people to use them, making sure they're maintained, and ensuring they're accessible in the communities that need them most.
Right, because what good is having this amazing technology if it's not available when and where it's needed? It's like having the latest smartphone, but no cell service.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting, bridging that gap between innovation and accessibility. How do we make these life-saving tools available to everyone, not just those in affluent areas?
It's a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity to make a real impact. Now, I've got to ask about this next finding because it seems like we're questioning a fundamental law of survival.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
Oxygen. Tell me, is it true that giving oxygen during CPR for newborns might not be as beneficial as we once thought?
You read that right. It's one of those findings that makes you do a double take.
I know. It's like you don't get more life-giving than oxygen, right?
Right.
So what's the deal? Why might it not always be the best course of action, especially for newborns?
Well, there are a few things to consider. First, the research suggests there might be some downsides to giving oxygen during CPR for newborns.
Like what could be the downside of giving someone oxygen?
It seems counterintuitive, but one concern is the risk of oxygen toxicity.
Oxygen toxicity, is that like too much of a good thing?
Exactly. And newborns, their organs are still developing. They're particularly vulnerable to it.
That makes sense. They're so tiny and fragile.
Right. Their little bodies are still calibrating. And this finding really highlights how medical guidelines are always being refined based on the latest research. This shift in thinking about oxygen for newborns is a prime example.
It's a good reminder to always be questioning, even when it comes to established medical practices.
Absolutely. What we thought we knew for sure a few years ago can change, and we have to be open to that.
Speaking of pushing the boundaries of what we thought was possible, I've got to ask you about ECPR. Have you heard of this?
Extracorporeal CPR. Oh, yeah, that's where things get really interesting. We're talking about essentially circulating a patient's blood outside of their body during cardiac arrest.
Okay, that sounds straight out of a sci-fi movie. How does that even work? Like you're basically hitting the pause button on their circulation.
It's a pretty wild concept, right? But in the most basic terms, that's kind of what's happening. It's a highly specialized procedure, usually reserved for the most critical cases where conventional CPR isn't working.
I can imagine. Hooking someone up to a machine that takes over for their heart and lungs, that's some next-level medical intervention.
It is. It's an incredibly delicate and risky procedure, and the cases where it's needed usually have extremely high mortality rates. But that's what makes this research so fascinating.
Okay, give me the good news. What's the verdict on ECPR? Is it working?
Well, early trials suggest that it might actually improve survival rates compared to conventional CPR in some cases.
Wow, so it's like giving someone a fighting chance when all other options seem exhausted.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that this research is still in its early stages. We need more data, larger studies to really understand who would benefit the most from ECPR and when it's best to use it.
So, lots more to learn. This is like a sneak peek into the future of resuscitation. Now, going from something super high-tech like ECPR to something that sounds a bit more, shall we say, old school.
Okay, I'm picturing like leeches and bloodletting.
Not quite. I'm talking about the research on double sequential defibrillation. 2 shocks instead of 1. That sounds intense.
Yes, that one definitely caught my eye too. Essentially, it involves delivering 2 defibrillation shocks very rapidly, using a specific placement of the pads. It's primarily for cases where that standard single shock hasn't been effective.
So is the idea to really give the heart a jolt, like a wake-up call it can't ignore?
That's a good way to put it. The thinking is that this double shock, delivered through a vest with electrodes on both the chest and the back, might be more effective at disrupting that chaotic electrical activity that's happening in the heart during cardiac arrest.
So does it work? What's the research say?
It's still early days, but the results so far are promising. There's only been one large randomized controlled trial so far, but that study showed that patients who received this double sequential defibrillation were more likely to survive to hospital discharge than those who received the standard single shock.
Wow, so it could be a real game changer, especially for those difficult-to-treat cases where that single shock just isn't doing the trick.
It definitely has potential. But as with any medical intervention, there are always caveats. More research is needed to confirm these initial findings and understand if there are any potential long-term effects from delivering that double shock. Plus, there are practical considerations.
Like what?
Well, for one, using this technique means having 2 defibrillators ready to go. That obviously has logistical and cost implications, especially when you think about equipping ambulances and hospitals.
Right, you've got to weigh those potential benefits against the practicalities of actually implementing it in the real world.
Exactly.
Okay, what else is on the agenda for today's deep dive into resuscitation research? What other mysteries are we going to unravel?
Well, we've got to talk about calcium. It's long been standard practice to give calcium during cardiac arrest under certain circumstances, like if the arrest is caused by low calcium levels or maybe an overdose of certain medications.
So it's like a targeted approach, addressing a specific underlying cause.
Right. But here's the thing. Recent studies have raised some questions about whether this practice is always beneficial.
Oh, really? I thought that was pretty standard procedure. So what did the research find?
Well, some studies are now suggesting that giving calcium might not actually improve survival rates, and in some cases, it might even be harmful.
It's like they always say, what doesn't kill you? Oh, wait, never mind.
Right. Makes you think twice. But it really highlights the importance of carefully considering all medical interventions, even those that have been around for years. What we think we know can change, and it's crucial to adapt based on new evidence.
I feel like that's been a major theme throughout this entire deep dive. Okay, so the jury is still out on calcium, more research needed.
Exactly. Never stop questioning.
Now, switching gears a bit, the article also mentioned some really interesting developments in how doctors predict neurological outcomes after someone's had a cardiac arrest.
Oh yeah, that's a crucial area of research.
Because it's not just about restarting the heart, it's about making sure the brain is okay too.
Exactly. Being able to predict whether someone will have lasting brain function after their heart stops is huge, both for making treatment decisions and for helping families understand what to expect.
And emotionally, it must be so difficult for families to navigate that uncertainty, hoping for the best, but fearing the worst.
Absolutely. It's an incredibly difficult situation. But the good news is that research in this area is progressing rapidly.
Well, I'm all ears. What are the latest breakthroughs? What's giving doctors more insight into how the brain recovers after cardiac arrest?
The article highlighted a few promising areas, including using brain biomarkers and EEG patterns to get a clearer picture of what's going on.
Okay, so instead of just relying on external observations, hoping for the best, we're starting to use more sophisticated tools to look inside the brain.
Exactly. For example, there's a biomarker called NSE, which stands for neuron-specific enolase. And basically, when brain cells are injured, NSE is released into the bloodstream.
So the more NSE in the bloodstream, the more likely it is that there's been significant brain damage.
You got it. So by measuring these levels, doctors can get a more objective indication of how severe the brain injury might be.
It's like having a window into what's happening inside the brain. So
Yeah.
cool.
It is pretty amazing. And EEGs, those are electroencephalograms, they're being used in new ways too.
Hmm.
By analyzing specific brainwave patterns, doctors can actually identify signs of brain activity that might indicate a better chance of recovery.
This is also fascinating. It feels like with each new discovery, we're getting a clearer picture of how the brain responds to cardiac arrest. So what's next for resuscitation research? What are the big questions that scientists are trying to answer now?
Well, there's a whole section in this research article called Beyond the Headlines that covers even more groundbreaking findings. For example, remember double sequential defibrillation, that double shock technique?
Oh yeah, that one definitely made an impression.
Well, it turns out there's even more to it. The research suggests it might be particularly effective in cases of refractory ventricular fibrillation, which is a really dangerous heart rhythm problem where the heart's struggling to beat properly.
Okay, I'm going to need you to break that down for me. Refractory what now?
Right, medical jargon, sorry.
Yeah.
Basically, it's when the heart's electrical activity is so chaotic that it can't maintain a normal rhythm. And it's called refractory because it often doesn't respond to the standard single shock defibrillation.
Ah, so it's like the heart is stuck in a danger zone, and that one shock just isn't enough to shake it out of there.
Exactly. And in these cases, this double sequential defibrillation, where the electrodes are placed on both the chest and the back, seems to be more effective at disrupting that chaotic rhythm and giving the heart a chance to reset.
It's like giving it a more powerful jolt, a stronger signal to get back on track.
That's a good way to think about it. But again, as with any new technique, there's still a lot we need to learn. More research is needed to confirm these initial findings, and we need to rule out any potential long-term effects of that double shock. Plus, there are practical considerations.
Like what?
Well, for one, using this technique means you need two defibrillators ready to go, which obviously has logistical and cost implications. Not to mention ensuring that hospitals and emergency responders have the equipment and training to do it safely and effectively.
It's a good reminder that even the most promising research has to be translated into real-world solutions. It's not just about what works in a lab, it's about what works in the field.
Exactly. And speaking of promising research that might need a closer look, remember how we talked about giving calcium during cardiac arrest in certain situations?
Yeah, like when the arrest is triggered by low calcium levels or a bad reaction to some medications.
Right. Well, some new studies are making doctors rethink whether that's always the best approach.
Really? I thought that was pretty standard practice. What's changed?
Well, new evidence suggests that giving calcium might not always improve survival rates, and in some cases, it might even have negative effects.
Wow, that's a pretty significant development. So what prompted this shift in thinking? Why are doctors now questioning a practice that's been around for so long?
Well, that's how science works, right? It's a constantly evolving process. What we think we know based on experience and observation sometimes turns out to be more complicated than we initially thought.
So it's not necessarily that the old way of doing things was wrong. It's more like we're constantly learning and refining our understanding based on new evidence.
Exactly. And this new research on calcium is a perfect example of that. It highlights the importance of constantly evaluating and questioning, even when it comes to long-standing medical practices.
And not being afraid to change course when the evidence points in a new direction. It's about being willing to adapt and evolve as our understanding grows.
You got it. Now, ready for one last mind-blowing finding from this research?
Lay it on me. This entire deep dive has been full of surprises, so I'm ready for anything.
Well, it has to do with something we've touched on throughout this whole deep dive, the crucial moments after cardiac arrest, and specifically the challenge of predicting those neurological outcomes.
Oh, right. We were just talking about how researchers are using brain biomarkers and EEG patterns to get a clearer picture of what's going on inside the brain after the heart stops.
Exactly. And it's not just about getting a snapshot of the damage. It's about understanding how the brain recovers or doesn't after being deprived of oxygen.
So it's like we're moving beyond just restarting the heart. We're trying to understand how to protect the brain during those critical minutes and give people the best possible chance of bouncing back, neurologically speaking.
Exactly. It's not just about survival anymore. It's about quality of life after a cardiac event. And this research into neurological outcomes, well, it's leading to some truly groundbreaking discoveries.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, did you know that there are specific brainwave patterns that can actually predict the likelihood of someone regaining consciousness after cardiac arrest?
Seriously.
Yeah.
It's like the brain is sending out an SOS. And now, finally, we're starting to learn how to read those signals. So what are these brainwave patterns telling us? Can we actually decode them?
You're exactly right. It's like deciphering a secret code. Certain patterns, even in patients who are still unconscious, can indicate a higher probability of them waking up and having good neurological function.
So it's giving doctors a whole new way to assess how severe the brain injury really is.
Exactly. And with that information, they can make more informed decisions about the best course of treatment. It's all about giving patients the best possible chance of a full recovery.
That's incredible. It's like we're not just restarting the heart, but also giving the brain the best possible chance to heal. So what's next for this research? What are the big questions scientists are trying to answer now?
One of the biggest questions is how to use this knowledge to develop new treatments that can actually improve neurological outcomes after cardiac arrest. Imagine if we could give medications or use specific techniques like targeted cooling to protect the brain during those critical minutes when it's most vulnerable.
That would be a game changer. It's like taking everything we've learned about resuscitation to the next level, moving beyond simply restarting the heart to actually giving people their lives back fully intact.
Exactly. And that's what makes this field so incredibly exciting. Every new discovery opens up a world of possibilities for improving patient care and saving lives.
Well, this has been an incredible journey exploring the cutting edge of resuscitation research. From those specialized CPR techniques for drowning victims to this high-tech brain monitoring, it's clear that the field is constantly evolving.
It truly is. And the most exciting part is that this is just the beginning. There's so much more groundbreaking research happening right now, research that has the potential to completely transform the way we approach cardiac arrest and other life-threatening emergencies.
It's a good reminder that we should never stop learning. There's always something new to discover. And for our listeners who are eager to dive deeper into this fascinating world, where should they go?
Well, for those who are ready to go all in on the nitty-gritty details, the full ILC report is the ultimate resource. It's packed with data and insights from leading experts in the field. But if you're looking for a more digestible overview, there are plenty of summaries and articles available online that break down the key findings in a more user-friendly way.
I might even suggest revisiting certain parts of this deep dive after exploring those additional resources.
Yeah.
Sometimes hearing the information the second time with a bit more context can really solidify those key takeaways.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe by the time we get together for our next deep dive, there will be even more groundbreaking discoveries to unpack. This is a field that never stands still, and that's incredibly exciting.
It certainly is. And on that note of endless possibility and the power of scientific discovery, we're going to wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive.
Until next time, stay curious.
And keep those questions coming.